language, so you cannot use that as a variable name. So these are some examples of variable names that are not good. I mentioned earlier that when you do create variable names, you want to make sure they're meaningful. We talked about comments already and the importance of comments for self-documentation and understanding the code. Meaningful names are the exact same thing. If you have meaningful names in your code, it can increase the readability of the program. It's much easier to follow, and it also helps in the debug and documentation process. So use meaningful names, and we'll be doing that throughout all the examples that we go through. So once we name the variables and we have a variable, well, what about the data that's associated with that variable? That's referred to as a data type. So some types of data in programs can be numbers, letters, or words, right? We just talked about how you can have 10 and 20 as values, and you can also have alphanumeric or strings or characters. So the computer, depending on that type of data, needs a way to identify it so that it can do certain things. It really just affects the size of the data in memory, how it's stored. So a data type represents a type of the data which you can process using your program. Examples of types of data I mentioned: numbers, letters, and words. Those are represented by specific keywords in the programming language. So examples of keywords in C that represent data types are ints, floats, and doubles. And we're going to talk about these specific data types and what they mean in another lecture. But data types are important because you have to specify the data of the variable when you create it. And the data types are going to correspond to the byte sizes, depending on the operating system, the architecture of your program. So again, it all has to do with size and how this stuff is stored in memory. The program needs to know, do I need to allocate 8 bytes, 4 bytes, 6 bytes? And it all depends on the data that's being stored. And the way that the program knows how to do that is you specify a data type. There's also this idea, or maybe you've heard of this term, called primitive data types. These are types that are not objects, and they store all sorts of data. In C, all we have is primitive data types because we have no objects. So everything is a primitive data type in C. Now, if we want to actually start using variables in our program, we first have to declare them. Declaring a variable means that you specify the type of the variable followed by the variable name. So you use the data type followed by the name. And this tells the compiler how a particular variable will be used by the program, and it will also understand how much data to store in memory, whether it's 8 bytes, 4 bytes, and so forth. So for example, there's a reserved order keyword in C named int. That's used to declare a data type of type integer. And so if you wanted to create that in your program, you'd first have to identify the data type, the keyword, which is int. Then you'd have to have the name of your variable. That's also referred to as an identifier. And then at the end, you'd have to have a semicolon, because remember in C, all semicolons end all statements. So the actual syntax looks like is like type specify or data type specified after with variable name followed by the semicolon. You can also declare more than one variable on a single line by using a comma, or you can declare variables on separate lines. It all depends, but there is syntax for comma separated variables. And C requires you to specify all program variables be declared before they're used. So declaration is basically just telling your program, this is what I have. It's not telling you how you're using it. It's just saying, this is what I have in my program. I have a variable named int. I have a variable that's going to store a decimal number, things like that. So here's an example. We have the type of the data, which is int, and then the variable name, and here it's just x, and then we have a semicolon. Another example, if you wanted to create multiple variables on the same line, you can separate them by commas. So in this example, we have 3 variables of type int